one of the first things to understand when we talk about the principles and spirit of the military is that military men have throughout human history been instruments in the hands of the larger forces at work. Call them cannon fodder or fresh fish or pawns. Countless human lives have been lost, young lives snuffed out in their prime, slaughtered, maimed, millions gone to their deaths, unnamed and unsung, for some individuals or ideals, identities or interests. But what has through time motivated these common men in various armies? What made them submit their will, surrender their fate, and sacrifice their lives for the ambitions of a few, a collective idea or geographical entity, and continues to, is what I talk about here. My intention when I was thinking about a title and trying to structure this talk was to more holistically address this issue, covering some of the other connected things that have become recurring themes in social media. The main issues that form the context of my talk today are, firstly, a section which has been discrediting Subhash Chandra Bose for, among other things, the operative language of the Indian National Army founded by him, and the other, a recent Sangam Talks video that appeared among a set of panel talks released on 26/11 that featured Major General G.D. Bakshi and Major Gaurav Arya, moderated very admirably by Neeraj Attri, which excited a flood of opinions and reactions alleging lack of clarity of the military men on dealing with Islam. To begin with the latter, the allegations of a delusional secularism among Indian military men and a blind eye towards Muslims' motivations. We come across such views off and on social media when people see these Sarvdhan Pratna Sthals of the army or efforts of rapprochement taken up sometimes by the military in problem areas like Kashmir, Northeast, and also these statements that military men make sometimes that in the armed forces all religions are equal, at which people roll up their eyes and say, oh, the same secular talk. So is this true that military men are deluded by secularism? Is this a relevant criticism of the military? And how does it play out in reality? These are best answered by another set of questions. Is the military supposed to deal with Islamic ideology? And whenever it has dealt with Islam as a force, has it failed due to this alleged shortcoming of military men? How does the individual behave within the military, and how does the military behave as a unit? Now, first thing to understand here is that the military is just an arm of the state. It is not acting out any policy or aims of its own in dealing with entities outside of itself, because internally they too have a definite ethos, policy and code of conduct. Most important of these is that the military does not operate on ideology. This is the hallmark of a professional fighting force. A force that has been schooled on ideology will have differential levels of commitment among the men. It will be unreliable, inconsistent in performance, disjointed due to discrepancy in motivations, and prone to indiscipline and infighting, and not solely on account of religion. Ideological differences exist within the same religion as well. We have seen how acrimonious these fault lines within the Hindu identity can be on the issue of caste, subcaste, communal chauvinism. We have seen Rajput, Sikh, Maratha, Jat groups squabble amongst each other in social media. And it is not that lobbies don't take advantage of these. And take, for example, tomorrow if Rajputs refuse to serve under a Maratha officer, or Sikhs refuse to serve under a Tamilian officer, or Shias under a Sunni. Had we been a 100% Hindu country, even then implementing this Hindu army idea would not be possible due to infinite such diversity within the Hindu identity itself. Hindu armies did fight against each other in the past, sometimes collaborating with Muslims for one-upmanship against each other. There were Hindu regional armies, clan armies constantly fighting amongst themselves. So, ideology as identity or identity as ideology is a descent down the slope, because these ideas can be broken down into smaller and smaller interest groups. It's like introducing the devil within of disintegration. The very talk about any identity distinction, be it caste or religion or regional, in the military setting is equal to creating a fault line. Recently, I saw a video clip on internet. This never used to happen earlier. It showed a unit of the elite forces marching to this song, "Tum Bharat ke veer ho, jati bhed bhav ko mitaya ja," something along these lines. Now, this kind of activism is exactly what is not required for the military. It is like poison. Why would you talk about jati when it is not even a factor? कीड़ा डालने की जरूरत ही क्या है? The bottom line is that personal identities are meant to be dissolved in the military and another overarching unifying identity reinforced so that the personal motivations of the men do not interfere with their actions. It wouldn't be inaccurate perhaps to say that the military is meant to be a programmed animal with a predictable behavior. Secondly, such views give no thought to the vital question how one would implement this proposed Hindu identity-based military. How far can one go? Is it even possible? Is it practicable as state policy to legitimize suspicion against a group of people and exclude them from service? And then who all will you exclude? Is it possible to predict desertion? Which identities are prone? Have Hindus not deserted? The biggest desertion in the history of Indian Army since independence has been by Sikhs. So shall we exclude Sikhs now from the military? We had recently a lot of these retired officers of a particular persuasion coming out in open support of the subversive farmers' agitation. So now will we start picking army men on the basis of their political allegiances? These do sometimes come in play in appointments at senior influential posts, but this is not the basic ingredient of the military. Moreover, outlooks and attitudes are constantly changing. Interest groups keep realigning themselves. The military cannot stand on such shifty ground. It is important to understand that any ideology, Islamism, Dalitism, Hindutva, communism, identity chauvinism, socialism. A couple of years back, there was a whole lot of bilge against the Sahayak system. By the way, this nonsense emanated from the Hindutva camp, and which is foolish considering the military is a strictly hierarchical system, which is crucial for enforcing discipline. All these notional boxes are harmful for the integrity of the armed forces. And mentioning all these ideologies together does not mean that I am equating them. I have my own personal thought and rationale on which of these is valid for me. What I am saying is that these simply do not come in play in the military. The question is irrelevant to them. Then these Sarvdharm Pratna Sthals in army units. They serve a definite purpose of providing for all personnel a place to seek solace in their personal spiritual belief in times of difficulty, hard times like marching into a grim battle where death's just lurking around the corner. Now, obviously, a Muslim soldier won't go to a mandir to pray, but that doesn't mean that by going to his prayer area, he is pursuing Islamic talim. All religion prayer areas are not meant to serve a religious purpose and neither for making any political statement. Rather, these are to reinforce the principle of equal treatment to all, which is actually the case. In the military, there is no appeasement, no favor, no reservations. The strength of the military lies in making it fight on a uniform set of ideals rather than on uniform ideology. And the latter is in fact unachievable since it is impossible to completely empty the human mind of personal motivations. It is imbecilic to talk about basing the armed forces on unified Hindu identity when no such unified identity exists at the political level. And this is the reason we have identity-based politics, exploiting group sentiments. Parties across the board do so, right, left and center, all of them. BJP is also guilty of it. Their last political campaign in Bengal played two identities, Brahmin versus subaltern, Rajbanshi versus Bengali, creating fault lines which had been absent until then. And politicians will continue doing this. Therefore, trying to forge unity in military based on a Hindu identity will invariably fail, because the roots of the military men are in their society. We have an example before us of Pakistan, a state created on a single, supposedly unifying idea of Islam. But where are they today? They are fractured along Sindhi, Baloch, Pathan, Punjabi, Mohajir identities. So the glue of the military consists of different elements. The ideals that inspire the highest level of commitment among military men are usually very straightforward, simple, universal, and clearly defined. Courage, honor, manliness, fidelity. The oath of allegiance that military men take becomes a significant part of their character and personal integrity. We'll come on this later. Then service, sacrifice, valor, comradeship, and most importantly, discipline and obedience. These values are inculcated through years of training and conditioning, the structural basis for which is the regiment and its long-standing tradition. We will look into this too in a little more detail when we go into the desertions in British Indian Army. A definite set of regular practices, behavioral constraints, and moral code of conduct common to the entire military is laid down and rigorously enforced from the inception. But you may notice that patriotism is not a term that figures in these. One may say, it is often alleged, this is because we inherited the present structure of the armed forces from the British. But we have learned from experience that this is the most effective and successful template for the military. The reason for this is that patriotism can be defined in many ways. It can be and often gets restricted to more limited, narrower identities, which is what happened with Hindu armies in the past. It is not that they were not patriotic, but there was discrepancy in what they saw as patriotism. And this is also because army is not about emotionalism, but professionalism. Emotionalism doesn't work in the army, otherwise a whole lot of military decisions will go wrong. Patriotism of army men is not declared as an absolute ideal, but implied. It is expressed in unflinching commitment and awareness that they are the last line of defense and a do or die attitude, no matter what. It is somewhat like a marriage, if I may use that parlance, more about commitment than romance. One important note on identity and cohesion. Although we follow the structure and system of military created by the British, there's an important difference. The British fostered factional identities and identity-based regiment composition in order to enable them to use the native army for their advantage. And these were often fallacious. For example, the martial versus non-martial classes, the deliberately created chauvinistic notions based on identity, like in case of Sikhs. These things have undergone successful alteration in Indian Army. Many strictly ethnically rooted regiments have been replaced by general regiments. Some ethnicity-based regiments have been continued for their historical record and for preserving regimental tradition, but retaining only a definite proportion of men from the main group and introducing men from the general category. In officers' ranks, reservation has been done away with completely and are evenly represented now. So changes keep happening based on experiences with passage of time. Now, in that thread, there was also talk of Dharmic army, introducing Dharmic values among soldiers. But similarly, as patriotism, Dharma may be defined in an infinite number of ways, some of them even running counter to each other. Humans also don't have the same level or capacity or even inclination to grasp these concepts. So, any force that is oriented on such loose, flighty ideas will be incapable of acting with uniformity of purpose and will cave in at the first sign of adversity. Pakistan army tries to exploit religion and the sentiment of jihad, but this is precisely the reason they are not a very successful army, though constituted of the same racial and cultural elements. And admittedly, and this is something that my dad used to say, make no mistake, Pakistanis are equally good soldiers. Thing is, the raison d'etre of the Pakistani state and the basis of Pakistani identity makes their military susceptible to these failures. And this is what that Sangam talk was about, which I am referring to here. It was a set of 5 brilliantly conceived panels and topics for 2611. I would urge you all to watch them. The links of all these videos that I mentioned in the course of this session will be given in the description box at the release of this talk. Now, these exercises that the army holds, which this video talks about, of engaging with leaders of the Muslim community, is not because they are looking to appease them, but because this is what is set out as state policy. So this sort of chatter against the army is actually a case of barking up the wrong tree. There is need to put onus where it is due. Hindu nationhood, Hindu primacy in defining civilizational values and determining policy have to be deliberated and implemented at the level of the state. The army simply obeys. Which brings me to the next point. The Arthashastra lays down obedience as the primary virtue of an army. It mentions various kinds of armies that are at the disposal of a king. A standing army, hired army, irregulars, conscripts, then provincial armies, citizens' armies, militias, etc. They are distinguished as either Bhrita, that is the professional salaried army, and Mitra, armies and armed groups aligned along common interest. But it clearly says that a regular army made of obedient, strong and seasoned personnel is the most superior kind of army. Obedience is a paramount quality of the military, as well as strict adherence to a hierarchy. We have often heard this line repeated by military men: we just obey orders. Military men are trained for unfailing compliance to a chain of command, subordinating their personal opinions and preventing them from coming in play, unless authorized to exercise discretion by their designation or a mandate. Not enforcing this ideal can result in complete disintegration of the army. This deference to rank is followed even after retirement, and discipline is strictly enforced. You will recollect recently some of the retired officers got into political sparring on Twitter, and subsequently they had to withdraw their tweets. Some even deleted their accounts. Clearly, they had received a rap from the military authorities and asked to do so. This is the reason military men have always borne political blunders, diplomatic bloops, bureaucratic inefficiency, apathy of the political class, insensitivity of the society, even injustice to themselves without reaction. In the military, instances of indiscipline and infractions are very strictly dealt with. There are swift and serious consequences for the smallest violation of military code. Sedition का charge तो यूं ही लग जाता है. It is impossible to escape penalty, unlike normal legal procedure where even rioters and murderers get away. कि जी prove नहीं हुआ कुछ. It won't be an exaggeration to say that military men are pretty much programmed to obey orders. The modern military has been designed to act as a machinery with calculable outcomes. And believe me, there's no other way you would want the military to be. And the crux, Has the military ever failed in dealing with Islamists or Islamic powers on account of these principles at its foundation? Take the case of Major Mohit Sharma, who had infiltrated a Hizbul outfit and killed two dreaded terrorist commanders. Would such an operation have been possible without thorough study of the psychology and motivation of the militants? So, military does carry out studies, especially at the level of commanding officers. There are formal trainings on the factors that affect the morale of the men: loyalty and discipline, authority and obedience, the cohesion of military units, and the aspect of desertion as well, both historical and potential. They periodically review the morale of the ranks and are also required to study the psyche of the populace they interact with. In training, the officers study psychology, subordination, and the basis of discretion, various military histories, strategy. They are constantly being sent off to some or the other course. These are study courses throughout the service career. आप क्या समझते हैं वहाँ बेवकूफ़ बैठे हैं कि आप सिखा देंगे जाके? Then a thorough orientation on the socio-religious background of the regimental unit they will command, their characteristics, sensibilities and sensitivities, regiment history. Ideology is also studied, especially when dealing with ideologically motivated adversaries, but the military itself is not oriented along these lines. You will never hear such things from them like, ये लोग तो ऐसे होते हैं, मुसलमान तो वैसे होते हैं. Prejudice and ideology are useless for them. But this doesn't mean that they are oblivious to how Islam motivates, for example, the Pakistani army and the terrorists. All the same, when an army officer says that he is confident that a Muslim Indian Army soldier will cover his back just as well as a Hindu soldier, he is not mouthing mere homilies, because unlike politicians, he knows he will have to put his life on his word. So, how it works is that military men are not invested in any set of ideas like socialism or secularism, because they are not into posturing. Their focus is on what works and what not for the military to function as an efficient unit. So, equality for all works and it will be enforced. In the end, my question to all these commentators would be, why would you want to mess in a system which is working so well? And it has never worked this well in entire pre-modern history. Talking of history, let us go to the origin of this term Hinduization of the army. Hinduization of the army did figure frequently in the concerns of Hindu leaders during the independence struggle. And not just Savarkar, there was B.S. Munje, Balakrishna Shivaram Munje, also a Hindu Mahasabha leader and Savarkar's predecessor. He founded the Central Hindu Military Education Society for this purpose by creating a strength of able-bodied youth in this organization for feeding into the army. The concern appears in Ambedkar's writings also, and it is discussed quite extensively in letters exchanged between Savarkar and Rash Behari Bose. But this Hinduization was not about inserting Hindutva ideology among the ranks. This talk was about increasing the proportion of Hindus in the British Indian Army, because owing to the recruitment pattern post the 1857 War of Independence, the proportion of Muslim soldiers was almost 70%, the greater majority of them being Muslim Punjabis. Muslims from United Province, present-day Uttar Pradesh, were also not preferred for the same reason. They were thought to be more prone to rebellion. And the worry of Hindu leaders was not so much the aspect of loyalty, but that in the event of eventual partition, Pakistan would have an army far bigger than India. Demands had been raised for some time for providing military training to youths in schools and colleges in the provinces, and the measures were quite successful. The Muslim proportion in army went down significantly within 10 years in 1945 to about 34%. This was similar to the term Indianization of the British Indian Army, which was meant to have more Indians in commanding positions in the army. This was set in motion in the beginning of the 20th century by the British government, due to which the number of Indian officers coming out of the Indian Military Academy also went up over the same period. Let us come back to the topic of the military, Indian National Army, and desertions. Irrespective how we parse the causes of desertions, and the causes are many, a variety of personal and psychological factors, but they boil down to three basic factors: breakdown of discipline, deficient regimental cohesiveness, which may be because of fresh recruits who have not been drilled long enough into the regimental order, or a new commanding officer who has not had the time to build a close association and rapport to inspire trust among the men, and lack or loss of motivation. If one regards the INA desertions carefully, behind all myriad motives, it was basically one or a combination of these three factors at play. There's this line from Colonel Prem Sehgal's memoirs, which Tiwari quotes, that part of the reason that some Muslim soldiers may have been inclined to desert was on account of Turkey's alignment along the anti-Axis powers. Turkey's alignment alongside the anti-Axis powers has had a very adverse effect on certain Muslim officers. In spite of our efforts to explain to them the circumstances under which Turkey has been forced to join the war, the officers feel that by fighting against powers that are allied with the Turks, they are being disloyal to Islam. Which side Turkey would join may have been playing on the minds of some Muslim soldiers, but that by itself is unlikely to have been a big factor, since Turkey entered the war only in February 1945, and by July 1944, INA was already in retreat on all the fronts: Imphal, Burma, Kohima. The morale of the INA men was rock bottom by then, and they saw desertions in droves. Moreover, it is important to know that many of the soldiers of INA did not in the first place join INA out of reasons of patriotism or the appeal of the call of freedom. Fact is that a great many POWs had joined simply to escape the hardships and privations of captivity, or because they had been coerced in some manner, threatened with dire straits, or in cases where regimental loyalty was weak. It is suggested that some may have even joined for self-advancement, as they got promoted several rungs in rank. But in reality, there were fewer committed volunteers who had joined for a genuine zeal for the armed struggle for independence. Many did join purely out of patriotic motives, others who were inspired by the persona and leadership of both, but it cannot be said with certainty if they comprise the majority. A large number of officers, VCOs, Viceroy's commissioned officers, and other ranks actually remained loyal to their oath and even suffered horrible consequences, sent to work on the Siam-Burma Railway, which came to be known as Death Railway. Many were transported to Malaya and left to die without food or resources, abandoned to harsh tropical weather and disease. Whether the Japanese shot them or ate them, as some horrifying tales narrate. And a word of caution is due here. British accounts greatly exaggerated these, adding phony, unverifiable details to increase shock value with certain intention, which however may not be true. But refusing to renege on their oath to the king and not joining INA was a tough choice, which the more seasoned and steadfast soldiers seem to have stuck to. In particular, those from regiments where officers and VCOs had remained together over longer time, keeping the regimental bond intact. And it was not that the Japanese did not realize this. Therefore, resistant officers and VCOs were put in an officers' separation camp to talk them into joining, with the hope that other ranks would follow. In cases where the Indian officers and VCOs remained steady, the rank and file followed their example, no matter what fate it brought them, and this number was not insignificant. It was almost around 11,000 or so. As I explained earlier, often this had more to do with the character of a soldier and the nature of the army itself than strictly loyalty to the British. It was to an extent also a result of uncertainty over the outcome of the war itself. They did not really believe Japan would win it. After taking the oath of allegiance, men would not be inclined to frequently reappraise their commitment to their army against personal considerations at each new prospect, unless forced in a situation to do so, which is what happened in case of Sehgal, Shahnawaz and Dhillon. The Baloch regiment, which was Prem Sehgal's regiment, was comprised of Punjabi Muslims, Pathans and Dogras. Of these, Punjabi Muslims had a strong loyalty to the British and were reluctant to join. So, though the Dogras and Pathans wanted to join, they would not because they did not want to leave their Punjabi Muslim brothers behind. So, regimental loyalty is a very important factor in preserving esprit de corps of a military force. This feeling is relatively weak in fresh recruits. Fresh recruits learn to school their emotions over time, tempered through strict discipline until this becomes second nature, where emotions do not interfere with set action. Therefore, military is also a dharma, a unique mental and physical makeup, and a community in itself. In the Sikh Mutiny of June 1984, it was found in the course of investigations that almost all the deserters were raw recruits. Subsequently, a greater proportion of the mutineers were pardoned after serving minor sentences, though not taken back in service. Only a few faced harsh sentences, and a handful were also reinstated. The British Indian Army in World War II was literally a freshman army, owing to the manifold increase in its numbers from 189,000 in the pre-war period to 2.3 million during the war. From December 1932 to May 1941, the number of Indian officers passing out of IMA was 524, and this number had gone up to 9,540 by the end of the war, because training for officers was reduced from 2.5 years to a 6 months term of emergency commission. For men, this period was even shorter. Some of them found themselves thrust into the battle scene after barely a couple of months long training. They were little more than peasants in uniform, still ruled by their prejudices and passions. There was a lot of regimental displacement due to reshuffling. Officers and men transferred to and from different regiments just before deployment, which eroded their regimental bond. There was discrimination and ill feeling between British and Indian officers. The mass surrender of British and Indian officers had been a bewildering experience for the men, and for the Indian officers, as Shahnawaz recounted later, a humiliating feeling, being handed over like cattle to the Japanese. Captain Shahnawaz had barely 5 to 6 years military experience behind him, and Captain Prem Kumar Sehgal had just 2. Lieutenant Gurbakh Singh Dhillon had risen from the ranks and had barely 2 years experience as an officer, which was marked with resentment on account of discrimination and hostility from British officers. He complained about despondence on account of lack of discipline and flagging morale among the ranks. Shahnawaz had been transferred to 14th Punjab just before the war. They were the first 3 of the 24 picked for court-martial proceedings. Their being Hindu-Muslim Sikh was purely coincidental, and Congress touted them as mascots of their favorite Hindu-Muslim Bhaichara front. This was not on account of any selection policy of INA, which had the constraint of availability and ability. A somewhat similar situation had prevailed in the 5th Light Infantry, which mutinied in 1915 in Singapore, an example which Tiwari has also cited. They had a weak and discordant leadership at the level of officers and 2 hostile factions within the ranks. And there were also other reasons for discontent. Suspicion was rife. Such a unit will see desertions at the very first occasion. It is not so much the immediate reasons behind mutiny, which in this case was said to be rumors of being sent to Europe to fight the Ottoman Empire against their Muslim co-religionists, but an environment where such personal motives come in play, and that is breach of discipline. A contrasting case was in the Mesopotamian theatre, especially Gelibolu, and North Africa during World War I, where the Turks met British expeditionary forces consisting of mainly Muslim Indian soldiers, hardened, combat ready soldiers who fought stoutly against them, and in spite of a fatwa being in place for an Ottoman global jihad. As a matter of fact, the Turkish president Ataturk was very bitter on this account. He had complained about it to Muhammad Iqbal Shehzai during the latter's visit to Turkey after World War II. During the war, Indian POWs from British colonies, a majority of whom were Muslims, were moved to Wilmstorf camp near Berlin. It was known as Halbmond Lager or the Half Moon camp, a befitting name because it was a camp exclusively for Muslims. The Ottoman Sultan was keen to recruit the Muslims from the POWs to fight for the cause of Islam, which he requested of his German allies. Following this, a variety of propaganda measures were carried out in the camp to entice Muslims to join the Turks and wage jihad against Britain and France. It was known as the Jihad Experiment, carried out under Max von Oppenheim, a special paper which spread anti-British sentiments, was published in Urdu as well as in Hindustani, titled Hindustan, and widely distributed among the POWs in Interlager, or the camp of Indians, which had mostly Muslims but also some 80 odd number of Sikhs and Hindus. A mosque was built in a record time of about 5 weeks, and religious activities were promoted to the preference of Muslims. A cleric by name Sheikh Salih al-Sharif mentored the Muslim soldiers. Around 2,000 Muslims had joined, but among South Asian Muslims there were only a handful of Pashtuns, a couple of dozen. Not a single Indian Muslim wanted to fight for the German Ottoman allies. And it is not that these soldiers were British loyalists, since those with strong pro-Britain leanings had already been segregated and sent to a different camp. So it is important to look at facts, however, in consideration of all the facts related to a matter in order to get a clear and unbiased picture. Sarvesh Tiwari quotes some of the statements of the officers during the INA trials to make a case that they joined for the sake of Islam and with the hidden motive of sabotaging the effort. Firstly, it must be said that these statements cannot be taken on their content, instead on the intention behind, which was to defend themselves against the charge of renouncing their oath to the king and waging war against the king. They had to prove that they had joined out of coercion or some other ulterior motive rather than for the independence of India or moved by Subhash Bose's mission, because that would have confirmed the charges. And since they were categorized for prosecution as blacks, which meant that at the initial interrogation they would have admitted being fervently committed to Bose's cause and had to be dealt with severely, rather than the whites and greys who said they joined due to other less honorable reasons. The blacks were faced with extremely harsh punitive action, and their change statements too were not enough to save them. It's a different thing that later the sentences had to be dropped because of an unprecedented wave of popular public reaction in their support. So for defense during the court procedures, they gave legally tutored statements. In an interview with Asaf Ali, one of the lead counsels of the defense committee, with a former POW, Captain Hari Badwar of 3rd Cavalry, who had not joined INA, had asked whether from the facts as known, the INA soldiers should not champion INA. And Asaf Ali had replied that they dare not take that line, as they would lose much ground in the country. He believed that Even if congressmen were in power, it would have no hesitation in removing all INA from the services, and that Congress would not hesitate to put INA leaders on trial when they came to power. So it is not surprising that INA soldiers gave calculated and ambiguous statements. Tiwari quotes Shah Nawaz's words from his autobiography to show that his loyalty was questionable, because he said that he had joined INA so that he could wreck it from inside. This is, however, not the complete statement. What he had said was to sabotage and wreck it from within the moment we felt that it would submit to Japanese exploitation. In his trial, he had claimed this repeatedly, that he tried hard to keep the rank and file out of INA and to persuade Mohan Singh to disband INA. He claimed that personally I wished to get out of the INA, but I had committed myself too far and could not retrace my steps, and that he set about to find such men for the INA as would be willing to fight the Japs if they were dishonest with us. He elaborated, stating that I also realized that if on going into India, which was probable due to poor British defences, the Japs were dishonest, I would be much more useful to my country with a rifle in hand in India than as a POW in Malaya. Now, how would a few INA soldiers with rifles in their hands prevent the Japanese if they did deceptively turn against India and Indians? To anyone, this would sound bizarre, unless one understands it is stated in the context of the charges against him. Even Prem Sehgal gave similar and equally weird reasons. He said if sincere and patriotic officers kept out of it, meaning INA, it would be quite easy for the Japanese to exploit their army. He explained, I finally made up my mind to join the Indian National Army because I felt that the Japanese were absolutely determined to go to India, and if they were accompanied by a really strong INA, the Japanese would not be permitted to commit the same atrocities as they had committed in Malaya and other countries in East Asia, and also if they did not honor their pledges regarding Indian independence, a well-armed and organized INA would be in a position to put up an armed opposition against them. So this appears to have been the standard line of defense. And Shah Nawaz never said that he joined for the interest of Islam, as Tiwari claims. He did initially get together a group of Muslim soldiers to discuss what their stand should be to protect themselves as a community. But this was the case with all communities. Muslims stuck with Muslims, Sikhs stuck with Sikhs, and Gurkhas with Gurkhas. They considered their communal interests. They resisted together the attempts to make them join, and in the end made the decision to join also together. Most importantly, these moves and statements were made in the context of the time before the formation of the first INA, which the POWs regarded with utmost suspicion and were still weighing their personal situation, options and opportunities, which is what happened in that situation which we heard about earlier in the Bidadari camp. But Shah Nawaz makes it clear that he joined ultimately only because he decided to fight for his country. And this was a solemn pledge the group of Indian officers took after dwelling on the prospect for long. As they described, going round and round the question until at last, setting an evening aside for the purpose, we met and examined the business methodically, item by item, point by point. R.M. Arshad testified at Prem Sehgal's trial that we discussed all the pros and cons. We unanimously decided that under the circumstances, we all owed our allegiance to our country, meaning India. All the officers who faced trial were charged with waging war against the king. Shah Nawaz was charged on an additional count for the murder of an INA soldier for deserting INA. His name was Sepoy Muhammad Hussain, and Shah Nawaz ordered his execution. Dhillon and Sehgal also faced charges of murder for the execution of 4 deserters, all Hindus: Hari Singh, Dhuli Chand, Daryo Singh and Dharam Singh. But the interesting thing about Muhammad Hussein's execution is that the order was carried out by a Muslim battalion commander by name Khazin Shah. He got a Sikh and a Tamilian and a petty orderly by name Jagri Ram to fire at Hussein. When Jagri Ram protested, saying that he wasn't up to the task, he got another soldier to hold the rifle over Jagri Ram's shoulder, curl his finger around the trigger and shoot at Hussein. So great was his contempt for the deserter. So how can you pick out Muslim names, twist facts and say that they were not loyal? There can be no doubt whatsoever that Shah Nawaz gave himself completely to the cause of India's freedom. And this is not just in his own words, but also testified by some others who spoke of his devotion towards Bose and Indian National Army. It is really shameful to smear his name out of prejudice, whereas there were so many who had deserted INA, Hindu, Muslim, as well as Sikhs, sepoys, as well as officers. There was Major Garwal in Gandhi Brigade. He just walked over to the British side. He was second in command to Inayat Jan Kayani, who was Zaman Kayani's cousin and who fought till the end. British intelligence reports testify that Inayat Kayani held off the British Indian Army doughtily till the very end in a guerrilla war at a place called Palel Tamu. Many surrendered because they were simply in a bad shape, without food, provisions, or prospects of winning. The supply lines were cut off after the Japanese withdrew. Many soldiers did not have shoes. Many were stricken with disease, and they had no medicines. The declassified file suggests that a large number of INA soldiers were actually disgruntled, disillusioned, and disheartened, and they did not want to fight a losing battle. Yet, so many fought on right till the end, or till their ends, irrespective of religion. It is unforgivable to question their commitment, picking out names on the basis of religious identity. Tiwari also mentions Captain Abdur Rashid's statement that his predominant objective in joining the INA was to serve the interests of Islam and safeguard the Indian Muslims from getting dominated by the Hindus and Sikhs of INA. What Tiwari doesn't tell you is that his lawyer was from the Muslim League. Initially, Muslim League stayed aloof from the INA trials because they had unambiguously supported the British in the World War. But when they saw that Congress had engaged a bevy of lawyers to defend the accused INA soldiers, among them several Muslims, and coming across as the representatives of Indian Hindus and Muslims, they did not want to lose their relevance and the opportunity to present themselves as representatives of the Muslims. So they also jumped on the bandwagon. They provided their own defense committee to one of the accused, and this man was Captain Abdur Rashid. So the arguments put forth for his defense are in consonance with the Muslim League's aims, only that they are even more absurd than the other INA men, which said that he joined INA to thwart the Hindu conspiracy of ruling whole India at the exclusion of Muslims with the help of Japanese. After sentencing, Muslim League claimed that Rashid had been a victim of religious discrimination. Tiwari also mentions the cases of Habibur Rahman and Mohammad Zaman Kayani, who went to Pakistan in 1947 and were involved in conducting the Qabaili raids into Kashmir. But in both cases, their joining Pakistan could not possibly be held against them. They were Muslims, perhaps in terms of insecurity, their communal instincts. They went where they thought they belonged. There was no INA that time, and they had no prospects in the army. In the 2 years after Subhash Bose's death, the communal situation in India had turned very vicious. In the post-World War II period, poised before an imminent division of the Indian Army on grounds of religion, choosing between India and Pakistan was regarded as an honorable choice for the military men. When these men went to Pakistan, they had Pakistan's interests in mind. Why wouldn't they? Is it expected that they would belong to Pakistan and pitch for India? Is that a realistic expectation? Then Habibur Rahman belonged to Bhimber. He had a personal immediate stake to have Bhimber as part of Pakistan. And Kiani had joined at the time of the first INA, before Subhash took charge. He was a confidant of Mohan Singh. But neither men had betrayed INA or Subhash Bose, and by all accounts fought valiantly. So what exactly is Tiwari trying to say? That Muslims should not have been taken into INA? Or that they should not have been appointed to high posts according to their experience and qualification? What exactly does he have a problem with? Would he much rather that Indian Muslims fought against us on the side of the British? What foolishness! And is he sure that desertions would not have happened in an all-Hindu army, or that they would have fought better? When Muslims were still at that time part of our country and formed a significant portion of the army, why wouldn't willing men be taken into INA? And as if Bose was greatly spoilt for choice, he only had those set of men to draw from that were there. When it comes to Islam, caution is well in place, but prejudice doesn't help get anywhere, realistically speaking. Only clear-sightedness does. To illustrate, let me draw an example from history. Many times I have seen Rajputs being reviled for having served loyally under the Mughals when their co-religionists or say their civilization was on the other side. But in reality, such clear lines never really existed in the past. And when such clear delineations did emerge in an enduring manner over time, then rulers or military commanders had the opportunity to assess on which side they stood and did sometimes switch allegiance. But measured against short-term developments and immediate motives, such switching of sides can only count as desertion. Now, why they took the decision to serve at all in Muslim armies under Muslim rulers also had definite causes. This is related to the design of Islamic rule itself in India. Although in Islam the mushrikun or idolaters are not entitled to dhimma, that is the status of protected citizens of an Islamic state. However, seeing the impossibility of conquering a subcontinent armed to the teeth, the Hanifi law was applied in India, whereby Hindus were treated as the people of the book, generally Christians and Jews, who became entitled to protection by payment of jizya. The conditions that it imposed were, as we know, highly humiliating. They were not allowed to wear rich robes, ride in palanquins, be horse-borne, make music, or take out processions, use a chhatri, basically anything that appeared defiant of the supremacy of Islam and Muslims. And most importantly, not allowed to bear arms. The only way they could continue to be armed was by serving in Muslim armies, a recourse open to dhimmis, and had the added advantage of exemption from jizya. Christians and Jews also served in Islamic armies, and so did Hindus. The alternative was to rush in blindly to war and be annihilated, which also would be futile, because militarily at that time they were weaker. At least they needed time to regroup, which Islamic armies did not allow. One defeat meant extermination and massacre of your entire country. There were many who carried on armed rebellions as well from the margins of the cities. But when caught, they met with horrifically cruel fate, and in the end their struggle was also fruitless because it did not bring long-term advantages. We hear about these rebels or lawless people in Islamic accounts, but clearly they were not an effective force. Their societies also suffered because they dwelt outside the bounds of society and law, like for example the dacoits of British India. Whereas the Hindu groups that decided to serve the Islamic State, even in humiliating conditions, could bargain for advantages, though limited but long term, and had greater success in preserving their social and religious values and even grow until they were in a situation to effect an overthrow of foreign yoke. But in the interim, it minimized conflict and losses and devastation, and to put off bloody face-offs till the time it was inevitable. And when it came to that point, there were do or die fights. On occasions, they offered resistance to attacks of iconoclasts, like in case of temple destruction in Kashi in Aurangzeb's time, which saw gritty resistance by local Rajputs at every step, inch by inch, at each household. Timur Lane faced similar resistance from Hindus in Delhi. This was possible only because they were armed. All this is documented. And it was not just Rajputs. Many other Hindu communities and clans of all castes made this choice. Had they not done so, they would have been demilitarized and disarmed within a couple of decades, which would have had a devastating effect on the capacity of the Hindus to resist. It was a payoff to keep their Kshatradham alive, continuing to bear arms even if in service of the Islamic State. Martial character can get lost within a single generation. How rapidly Hindus as a population were disarmed and weakened in constitution within 5 decades of the 1857 rebellion is clearly seen. This is the reason there was this talk among Hindu leaders of militarization of Hindus to withstand Muslim aggression. Another example is of the Marathas. Most of the Maratha Sardars had been serving in Muslim armies of the Deccan, and even at the time when Maharaj Shivaji was building his resistance against the Mughal Empire and other Muslim powers, many Sardars continued to serve these Islamic states, even though beckoned to fulfill a larger calling of Hindu Dharma. They did not instantly cross over to the other side. That doesn't mean they were traitors to Hinduism. They did just what soldiers would do by natural calling. This is the reason Shahaji Bhosle was against Shivaji's defiance of the Bijapur Sultanate, because he simply saw it as waywardness. Obviously, he could not grasp the vision and purpose that his great son was born to fulfill. Shivaji's band of men were initially seen as traitors. He was known as a mountain rat. The rallying around this larger purpose happened over time. The outrage that ultimately raised the indignance of the Maratha people to that level was the cruel execution of Chhatrapati Shambhaji. Even later, up till the time of Chhatrapati Rajaram and even Maharani Tarabai, we find them persuading the Maratha Sardars to join their cause. Eventually, they did. But the reason Marathas could put up a resolute struggle and fight back in spite of heavy odds was because they were seasoned soldiers. There was this discussion thread sometime back on Twitter where someone had claimed that the Marathas were a poor, starving, exploited lot of peasants who fought the mighty Mughals, a very romantic version of the rise of the Maratha people as half-wit subalterns fighting their oppressors. But this view is erroneous. On the contrary, they were men with generations of soldiering tradition. A subaltern army can never put up this kind of determined resistance, no matter how great and intense the force of their collective growls. And neither were they underfed. An army cannot fight without food on just inspiration. Marathas were in fact brilliant in resourcefulness and controlled sufficient logistical means to sustain the fight. Armies organized food if required through coercive means at times. And neither did Maharana Pratap live on ghas ki roti. He had considerable wherewithal to carry on a long-term struggle. They were not romantic fools. And if it comes to that point, a commander will negotiate a surrender instead of trying to make a wretched lot of men fight. This is what happened in case of INA when their supply lines ceased, as we shall see. So, these were the compromises through which Hindus in the past preserved the martial resources of their nation. And it is important to have faith on the wisdom of our ancestors, how they negotiated these extremely difficult times. This is the reason we survived, whereas so many cultures were obliterated by the marauding Abrahamic hordes. It is something to learn from instead of using these instances to pick at the communities and derogatorily refer to past personalities, like they do in case of the conciliatory approach adopted at times by the Rajput rulers, or Shivaji in the initial period of building his power, or Guru Gobind Singh. They were responsible for the welfare and survival of their people and preservation of their culture. ये नहीं कि जोश में आके झोंक दो सबको लड़ाई में. But then, why did not these men in Muslim armies sabotage it from within, one may ask. This is on account of the principle of military which I talked about. It is a kind of bind that military men operate in. You break it and you are no longer a soldier. If one began to condone such breach of loyalty in the military, it could happen for every other reason tomorrow by anyone. One cannot raise an army of deserters. Another way of saying it would be deserters are no good for any army. Savarkar makes it clear in the following words among his exhortations to Hindus when he was asking them to join the armed forces. One point, however, must be noted in this connection as emphatically as possible in our own interest, that those Hindus who join the British forces should be perfectly amenable and obedient to the military discipline and order which may prevail there, provided always that the latter do not deliberately aim to humiliate Hindu honor. How about vice versa? Did Muslims serve loyally under Hindu rulers? Now, there were some desertions and treacherous acts by Muslims in 1947 in the Jammu and Kashmir state forces. But it is important to understand that it was an extremely volatile and unstable political situation that time in a country in the process of being partitioned on religious grounds. Maharaj Hari Singh's army was fractured along the lines of religion, and some battalions of the state forces had already revolted. The British commanders of these Jammu and Kashmir regiments had also rebelled against the king and encouraged the Muslims to rebel. There was confusion on what constituted their state or country. But less than 2 decades later, in the same Jammu and Kashmir region, a Muslim majority battalion of Jammu and Kashmir, posted at a strategic location, served unflinchingly in the 1965 Indo-Pakistan War and in all wars subsequently with Pakistan. Muslim personnel have served with unswerving loyalty. There were also desertions of Muslims from the Indian Army after Indian Army entered the Muslim Principality of Hyderabad of Deccan in September 1948. But as already said, during the Hyderabad action, the Indian Army was in the process of division between India and Pakistan on grounds of religion. As Colonel Anil Athale has said, to call these acts as desertion would label the entire Pakistani army as deserters. It is akin to complaining about Muslims joining Pakistan. Take, for example, Air Marshal Latif, Idris Hassan Latif, who was Chief of Air Staff, Indian Air Force. He served in the same squadron as Asghar Khan, who joined Pakistan and went on to become the Commander-in-Chief of the Pakistan Air Force. Incidentally, Asghar Khan was strongly opposed to hostilities with India and tried to obstruct the Indo-Pakistan War of 1965 by constantly vetoing decisions on Operation Gibraltar. He was dismissed from service because of this. An interesting side fact: Asghar Khan's brother, Captain Aslam Khan, was in the Jammu and Kashmir forces, and during partition, he joined Pakistan Army. In November 1947, along with Major W. A. Brown of Gilgit Scouts, he played a leading role in inciting the rebellion against the Maharaja and also the so-called tribal rebels, which ultimately led to the control of Gilgit-Baltistan by Pakistan. Now, Asghar and Aslam belonged to the Afridi Pashtun tribes, who were settlers and not Kashmiris. They had served in the Maharaja's forces for almost a century, but had deserted en bloc during the Indo-Pakistan War of 1947 and 48. They justified it by cooking up a tale of a supposed massacre by the Maharaja's troops of their people in 1947, of which there isn't the faintest trace of an evidence except the testimony of one Ved Bhasin that has never been scrutinized. He was the Tista Talwar of those days. But a strong motive they did have. Their father, Brigadier Rahmatullah Khan, also retired from Jammu and Kashmir forces, was an active member of the Muslim League, and he had been put under arrest, regarded as an enemy agent by the Maharaja when arms had been recovered from his associates. So there were a strange set of motivations and confused loyalties at work in that time, which cannot be used for building an assessment for the normal course of things. Now, there were reports of many ex-INA soldiers in Pakistan being actively involved in militant Muslim organizations, and some reports suggested that many incidents of organized violence against civilians during the bloodletting of partition were committed by these ex-INA men. As already discussed, these men were not really professional soldiers, but mostly voluntary wartime recruits who had not shed their social and religious biases. Neither had many of them joined INA for some principle, but due to circumstance. And the compulsion of circumstance was just the same on both sides, for those joining INA as also for those recruiting them. Neither had a choice. So how is this a comment on INA's policy? Ex-INA men were not re-inducted in the regular army, and having no future otherwise would have sought to be rehabilitated through their political or religious organizations. Why INA men specifically were found to have been involved in killings of unarmed and innocent civilians during partition Holocaust is that the Muslim League had this as definite plan for them. And for this you have to understand Punjab politics in those days. Over 27% of the emergency recruits during World War II were supplied by Punjab, a figure of about 8 lakh able-bodied unemployed men, which was also a significant chunk of the electorate. The nationalist Punjab Unionist Party had this insight and had been developing a plan of canal colonies to employ these men. But the abrupt end of the war took them by surprise, and Muslim League, looking to exploit the post-war economic slump in Punjab, tipped them to the post, moving in quickly to offer an instant solution to the economic dislocation suffered by Punjab villagers by recruiting these ex-INA men in their ranks for the cause of Pakistan. So they were hired as goons by Muslim League to perpetrate violence on non-Muslims in a premeditated way along the pattern of Direct Action Day. They were not acting spontaneously. For this reason, ex-INA officers were engaged by Pakistani Army to recruit these men as raiders for the operation in Kashmir, which was conducted outside the normal chain of command of the army, just like Pakistani terrorist camps of today. So this had no intrinsic correlation with the INA chapter, rather with the question of discipline itself and the violation of a fundament of the military. Once breach of discipline in ranks is countenanced and condoned, a soldier is no better than an armed brigand. This is the admission of a Pakistani general. Pakistan learnt it the hard way. According to their own records, use of ex-INA soldiers for 1947 to 48 Kashmir operations had far-reaching and detrimental impact on the discipline of Pakistani army. 3 years later, several officers were arrested for the conspiracy to overthrow the civilian government. It came to be known as the Rawalpindi conspiracy, the first in a series of coups that marked Pakistan's short history. Almost all of these officers were found to have participated in the Kashmir operations. This illustrates somewhat why ex-INA men were not recruited in the army, neither of India nor Pakistan. Reason is that irrespective of the motive of their fight, they were by definition deserters. When they fought their former colleagues at the Indian border, they were basically fighting their own former comrades. That is a line that cannot be crossed in the military, no matter how lofty the supposed principle on which the soldiers may have acted. The principle of the military is unambiguous allegiance and unquestioning obedience to the force they have committed themselves to, and not working against the unit at any cost, because then anyone can start deserting on any personal principle. And that's why desertions are usually very thoroughly investigated, inquiring into all possible reasons and the people involved directly or indirectly. INA cannot be called an army of deserters, but definitely of the nature of a rebel force. Many in INA believe that as soon as they made contact with their Indian army colleagues, they would simply cross over and join them. But this did not happen. Both sides dropped leaflets beckoning the soldiers from the other side to join their cause. INA could not advance deep enough to drop these behind the British lines, but even if they did, it was not very likely that it would have brought out the response that they hoped. The British Indian Army units fought very well against INA, and the Indian soldiers who were fighting INA considered them as traitors who lacked the mettle to fight. There were several cases where INA soldiers were shot by Indian Army soldiers rather than being allowed to surrender. This problem was apparently so significant that British command had to issue a special order to Indian soldiers to prohibit the practice. This strong antipathy against the INA soldiers as a treacherous and unprincipled lot was primarily because of British propaganda that we talked about earlier. Accepting those who deserted the army back in service would result in grave compromise of discipline because it would lend respectability to acts of desertion. Leniency in treatment of acts of desertion is as good as encouraging it. Senior armed forces officers, Lieutenant General Sri Nagesh, Major General J.N. Chaudhary, and P.V.R. Rao of Defence Ministry were unanimous in their opinion that INA personnel should not be reinstated in the army. Giving them pension also would have been demoralizing for armed forces personnel because that would be akin to rewarding desertion and would equate them with soldiers who had served their army honestly. British propaganda had convinced them that by fighting on the British side, they were serving their nation. And the Indian political leadership also told them the same. But what they saw was a wave of support for the INA personnel, hailing them as patriots, which induced confusion in the sense of loyalty within Indian Army ranks as to who they owed it to. This could be damaging. They could at most have been given a freedom fighters allowance, but we all know the politics behind that, why it did not happen. It was there in the Congress recommendations, but Nehru did not implement it because apparently the British frowned at the prospect. So, how successful was the Indian National Army? Clearly, INA was not a force that could stand on its own. It remained an auxiliary force dependent on the Japanese forces to break the British lines. Bose was keen that they should have received more intense combat training, but the Japanese were mostly interested in using them as sleuthing and sabotage units. They were not adequately equipped or trained for combat, but they did see combat at 2 or 3 fronts. contemporary British accounts disparagingly refer to these engagements, but later accounts composed after perusing military records show that apparently INA did see intense action in some sectors and continued to hold out against heavy odds, often in pitiable condition, out of a stubbornness that can only be from firm commitment to a cause. It was clear from the very beginning that they were operating under the greatest constraints. But in the end, they were done in by the Japanese, who refused to provide the slightest help in any way once they were themselves on withdrawal mode. In one case, a Gurkha ex-Havildar commanding an INA platoon was invited to surrender by Indian Army. He replied back, scribbled on the back of one of these leaflets, "Gentlemen, I do not come," and fought on until he was killed. Bose's entire concentration towards the end had been to somehow provide for his men, rallying the Southeast Asian community to produce basics like shoes and clothes for the men. He did not have the resources of a state to support the war effort. The supply lines had crumbled and the men were left hanging on a bare thread. In the end, they surrendered because they simply did not have the means to sustain the operations. A majority of the ranks were raw recruits, and their officers did not have experience much beyond leading a battalion of commanding higher formations. But the most important factor behind the desertions was differential levels of motivation. I talked about this in the beginning, that the ideal of patriotism evokes varying levels of commitment among men and can also be different for different individuals. This was the reason that some INA men endured the harshest conditions to continue fighting till the end. There are some heartbreaking accounts of men laid up with disease or disability, saying that if they could just haul themselves up to hold a gun, they would still fight. On the other hand, there were those who buckled with much less and walked over to the other side. Many others abandoned the cause due to their individual motives. If INA had been supported by the resources of a state and sufficient logistics and arms, and continued combat ops as the force of an exiled government, they would have perhaps over time developed into a fine force with the mind and structure of a regular force and absorbed into the Indian Army later. That is the kind of support probably that Bose wanted to win from the Russians. But all that now belongs to the realm of could have been. The Indian National Army today is therefore assessed by the Indian Army more as a case of learning than in terms of victory or defeat. One clear victory of INA was, of course, the after effect of their struggle. The INA trials sparked off massive unrest across the country. The feeling was so strong that congressmen, in spite of themselves, were constrained to provide legal defense for the INA men on trial, engaging some of the top lawyers that time, Bhulabhai Desai, Kailash Nath Kadchu, Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru, Asaf Ali, and Nehru himself donned the lawyer's gown after many years of giving up practice. The Muslim League also decided to make their own defense counsel to make hay from the publicity that it drew. Indians strongly identified with the cause INA fought for, which got men in the regular ranks of armed forces thinking about their loyalties. This had a direct bearing in the form of a series of mutinies, beginning with the strike by the ratings, that is sailors, and officers of the Royal Indian Navy and Air Force from the ports of Mumbai and Karachi to Madras and Visakhapatnam and Calcutta in February 1946. The airmen too struck work at various places, including Karachi and Kalaikunda in West Bengal, and it was clearly this, from the words of the British themselves, that led to their hasty withdrawal from India, who actually had no intention to leave for a long time after the war, and wanted to continue milking their prime colony to rebuild a shattered post-war England. There was a strong possibility, as Mujibur Rahman had said, that partition would not have happened at all. At least it might have been possible to keep the Muslim majority regions within an Indian confederacy. It needed a leader who had the vision to take the divergent and hostile factions together, who commanded the respect of most denominations so as to reduce the Muslim League to a fringe element. There was only one man in India that time who had this kind of charisma, and that was Subhash Chandra Bose.